Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 11. Today we'll discuss strategies for summarizing. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your weekly homework document, and you'll need access to your Project 2 draft. Specifically, you're going to need one source from your Project 2 draft because you guessed it, we're going to be summarizing that source. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll define the term summary, we'll examine the rhetorical gains of summarizing other texts, and we'll discuss strategies for summarizing a text effectively. All right, so before we jump into the how we summarize, let's get some of the foundational information out of the way. First, let's define a summary. So when we think about a summary, this actually builds off of our conversations regarding incorporating direct quotes into our own works. And much like a direct quote, it is a common method for referencing other works. So as you go through and you compose Project 2 and 4 especially, you'll have the opportunity to really play around with various types of ways of borrowing from sources, be it a direct quote like what many of you did very well in Project 1, be it a summary, which I imagine many of you will play around with in Project 2, or paraphrasing, which we'll get into a little later on in the semester. So there are several ways that you can incorporate the works of others into your own original text to support whatever it is you happen to be reporting on or arguing. What's different, though, about a summary, especially in comparison to a direct quote, is the fact that you are simplifying an argument at large. So with the direct quote, you were really isolating maybe a sentence or two from the original source and sort of treating that in isolation, which is oftentimes which is what we do with direct quotes, and how direct quotes are often used in various genres of writing. Now, a summary, on the other hand, rather than isolating one or two sentences, you are basically giving a very quick and easy overview of what a text in its entirety looks like. And this applies to a text no matter how big. I mean, if you really wanted to, you could think about some of the largest books that you've ever seen, the largest works that you've ever seen, and even those are, you could possibly summarize. I mean, you would have to be really tinker around with how you go about it, but it's certainly possible. So with that, again, you're not just isolating, a paragraph or a section and talking about it like you would with paraphrasing. You're not isolating and discussing maybe one or two sentences as you would with a direct quote. Rather, you want to represent um, or communicate what a piece in its entirety looks like. So in doing that, there are a few key things that we're going to want to include. Now, what I'm going to discuss in terms of what to include will vary depending on the type of source that you use, specifically for Project 2. Remember, for Project 2, you have the opportunity to use popular sources. You don't just have to use scholarly sources like you will in Projects 3 and 4. Rather, if you want to throw in a BuzzFeed article, you can throw in a BuzzFeed article. If you want to include, an article from your favorite blogger, include that article from your favorite blogger. And so, of course, these are examples of more popular type publications or works, and they differ in important ways from scholarly works like what you would find in the library databases. So when we look at an academic work, when we look at a scholarly article or a scholarly piece, which could also be a book, it could also be an open access web text. There are a few ways that scholarly works can manifest, but if we are working with a scholarly work or an academic work, I use those two terms interchangeably, you want to highlight the main argument or hypothesis. That term can kind of go one way or the other depending on what field you're in. but highlight the main argument or hypothesis, then discuss the methods, and then, of course, address the conclusions. So, as you'd go through, perhaps a summary could say, in this work, author A makes this argument or poses this hypothesis. They test this hypothesis or they support this argument by going about their experiment in this way or performing this kind of a survey or collecting this kind of data. And then at the end of the day, they found that the experiment was a total success or the survey was an absolute failure. And this is what they think of that. So you can see here how we really are getting a truncated version of perhaps what a 30 to 50 page scholarly article really says. So you're saying, okay, here's what they're going into it saying. Here's what they want to argue. Here's what they want to prove. Here's what they want to test. Now, here's how they go about supporting that argument or testing that idea. And at the end of the day, with all of that considered, here's what they say. Here are the conclusions that they reached and what their thoughts are going forward. So you want to do that with an academic text. Now, if you're working with a more popular work, so like I said, this could be anything from a BuzzFeed article to a blog to even a TED Talk, things of that sort, things that have not undergone an extensive peer review process, much like academic works or scholarly works do. So if you are citing something that is more of a popular work, you want to highlight the main ideas. Sometimes they'll make arguments, sometimes they won't. That's just something that you have to kind of be prepared with to say, okay, well, if they're not making an argument, what's the main topic or what's the main focus of this particular piece? So if they do include arguments, of course, you want to note that as well. And then with popular works, oftentimes you are not going to encounter conclusions. And that is mostly because with these types of publications, they're not actively performing experiments. They're not actively going out and conducting surveys and talking to people in a more research type setting. So they don't have or they don't often include formal conclusions, much like you would see in an academic article or book. So in lieu of that, you can talk about the rhetorical strategies to say, okay, well, in order to really frame this topic or to support their argument, the authors or the speaker or whoever it is that you're citing appealed to pathos in this way, or appealed to logos in that way, or attempted to tap into ethos by doing this. And so that's where we can call back to our Aristotelian terms and say, okay, well, how are they trying to get the readers on their side to think of the topic in the way that they deem appropriate, or to accept whatever argument is that they are posing to the readers? Okay, so with writing a summary, I first want to start off to say that summary writing, especially if you are working on a topic that is particularly polarizing, and if it's a very lively discussion, I will say it can be hard. And I will say, even I as a writer have run into this where I will encounter works that I strongly agree with, strongly disagree with, perhaps, have no opinion one way or another on. Regardless, though, we are challenged as academic writers to summarize a work fairly, to not insert, at least in the context of the summary, to not insert our own opinions and views on the works of another. Of course, we can take that opportunity, but that's after we've concluded the citation, and said, okay, I'm done summarizing, what someone else has said. Now here's what I think about it. So, what's important to remember is that you must be true to what the original author says while also emphasizing those aspects of what the author says that interest you, the writer. So as you go through it, if there's one part, for example, of a TED Talk that you're citing that really stuck out to you, you can certainly emphasize that. You can say, throughout this TED Talk, while the speaker addresses several important points, they really emphasize this, or they make this really compelling point or argument by saying that. So, of course, you can emphasize things that you find particularly relevant, but you don't want to put words in, a speaker or writer's mouth. You don't want to lead your audience to believe that they said something that they really didn't, just on perhaps your emotional response to what your source is saying. So always remember to be true to what the source says. But if there are specific parts of the text that interest you or you find especially relevant, go ahead and mention that. Just make sure that, again, you are remaining true to the source. When you write a summary, then you also want to put yourself in the shoes of others. So you want to think critically to say, what does my audience need to know about this piece, especially as it relates to my own work? So think about, what does your audience need to know? What kind of information is going to be important for them to be aware of? Are there any key terms that you have to define before writing the summary? Um, is the author a particularly divisive character in the field, and you kind of need to build up the audience to say, okay, I'm going to cite so and so, get ready for it. So you want to think about, what does the audience or the reader need to know in that summary from that work, whatever it is you're citing, and are there any other considerations you need to be aware of for introducing the source, and talking about it afterwards. Now, if you don't do so, this can hurt your ethos as a writer, because if you go through and say, oh, well, this author makes this argument, and says, for example, let's say you're writing a paper on humane societies in the state of Utah, right? Let's say you're doing that and say, well, I read a piece from someone saying that it should be okay for pet stores not affiliated with humane societies to sell purebred animals that are not rescues in their own businesses. So, let's say that you disagree with that. So, um, a summary would read, the author suggests that stores should have the opportunity to sell really any animals that they see appropriate and that they have professional interest in. Now, if I were to strongly disagree with that and put words in the mouth of the source, I would say, this person, or this writer basically says it's okay to kill rescue animals or to have them be euthanized so other stores can sell whatever kind of animals that they would like, right? Well, I imagine the author probably never said anything along those lines, but that might be your response to it. That would be inappropriate in a summary and in an academic text. So you really do want to check your emotions as you're going through, especially if it is a particularly divisive source that you're referencing, study that you're citing. Just be sure that that is something you keep an eye out for in your own revisions. Okay, so let's now talk about how to write a summary. There are a few components that we want to be aware of and include in our summaries, regardless of what it is we're writing a summary on or what we're writing a summary for. These components can help you write a successful summary, again, regardless of the rhetorical situation. So the first thing that you'll want to do is you'll want to begin with the main argument. So, in his article, Dr. Jones argues that social media sites like Facebook and Twitter should wed the strengths of algorithm-based detection and human judgment to avoid fake news from trending. So, from this, I, as the reader, know that you're citing an article. I know the type of publication it is. If it is a video, if it's an article, if it's a book, if it's a website, I now know. I also know who is saying it. So Dr. Jones. I know I have a name to tie to the summary. So this is going to be very similar in terms of introducing and framing sources. It's going to be very similar to what we did when we talked about incorporating direct quotes. So we have included, okay, it's an article. Dr. Jones is the person who we're about to summarize. And then we include the main argument itself. So we'll get in more to specific word choice here in a minute, but we indicate that it's an argument through the use of the word argues. Of course, there are synonyms we could put in place there to say suggests, advocates, things of that nature. So, but we have clearly said to the reader, okay, Dr. Jones is making an argument. They're not performing an experiment. They're not conducting a survey, or they're not, kind of tinkering around with this idea. They are making an argument, and this is what the argument is. The next thing that we'll want to do is we will want to discuss the forms of support. Remember that this is absolutely critical when summarizing, especially in academic work. So we could say throughout the text, he draws from several sources to support his argument. More specifically, he relies on the theories of internet scholars like Cass Sunstein and Eli Pariser to unpack the idea that while algorithms are designed by humans, they often lack an ability to determine the validity of source material. He also examined several case studies from the United States, England, Germany, and Egypt to determine how well algorithm-exclusive programs detected and eradicated fake news from users' feeds. So from there, we have basically said, here are the other individuals that this source is pulling from. So Cass Sunstein and Eli Pariser. And if you're really researching anything in the humanities, communication, social sciences, anything of that sort, you will see a lot of references to other scholars, particularly other theorists. So unlike the sciences, you may not see, okay, well, this was our experiment, this was our, our procedure and the protocol we abided by. So you might not see that, but, saying, oh, he uses Cass Sunstein and Eli Pariser sort of as his framework, that too can be referenced and should be discussed in a summary. And then, of course, there were other ways in which Dr. Jones, in this example, supported his argument. He also looked at several case studies, and he looked at case studies from these specific countries. And this is what he was looking for. So we have a very clear way of understanding as the readers how Dr. Jones was supporting his argument and what he used to really unpack this idea he is suggesting. We then want to identify the source's conclusions. So after looking at several case studies from around the world, Dr. Jones concludes that when social media sites rely only on algorithms to determine the validity of news, fake news is more likely to appear in a user's trending feed. To better prevent fake news from reaching those online, he finds that social media sites should use algorithms for initial detection, but then require a human employee to evaluate the content and either make it available for consumption or remove it from the site's queue of stories. So we are left with a clear, okay, so this was Dr. Jones's argument. This is how we went about supporting and framing his argument. And once he did that, this is what Dr. Jones concluded. And these were the conclusions that he reached regarding this argument that he made. Okay, so now that we've got the basic structure of identifying the argument, discussing the methods, and identifying the conclusions, let's talk briefly about the language we want to use for summarizing. Much like with direct quotes, as well as when we discuss paraphrasing, there is signal language involved. Now, there are a number of ways that we can go about it, depending on how a source fits into our overall text. So you might find that some sources express agreement, others question or pose disagreement, others recommend, others make claims or arguments. So really, I can sit here and say, there's one type of signal word. No, there's really not, because, even two people can be pulling from the same source, but the ways in which you're using it in your own work might differ radically from one person to the next. So if we were to go through and we were to summarize a piece that makes an argument, much like what we saw with the Dr. Jones example, we could say Dr. Jones argues, Dr. Jones asserts, insists, reminds us, suggests, words of that nature that really indicate that there is a clear argument being made, or there is a clear argument that's going to frame the piece in its entirety. As you're going through, you may find that a source that you want to summarize agrees really well with another source that you are referencing in your synthesis. So perhaps a verb like acknowledge, endorse, corroborate, support. So you could say source B corroborates what I said was source A in that they think this is the best way to approach this problem. And then you would go through and summarize the text. You could also include sources that question or disagree either with your own thoughts or with the other sources that you have introduced into your synthesis. Now, this can actually be good practice for Project 4 when we have to engage directly with a counter argument. Some words that we could use there to indicate to our reader that what we're about to summarize either disagrees or questions either ourselves or other sources. We could say, source B complicates my views on this issue. Source C questions what source A concludes. Source B refutes source C. Source D renounces source C. So you can see there how we can certainly we've got a number of verbs that we can use that will help us indicate that relationship. Now, there are also, depending on the type of topic you're writing on, you might also find that recommendation verbs are helpful as well. So source A advocates for, source A implores, source A calls for, urges, things of that sort. So here's what I want you to do. Now that we have talked about why we summarize, how we can effectively, and I'll even throw this term out there, how we can ethically summarize. We've talked about the structure, language choices. We're going to do the lecture assignment now. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to select a source that you plan to include in your Project 2 draft. This can be an academic source. This can be a popular source. Really, it is entirely up to you and whatever you would like to summarize. So using the structure and language we discussed, I would like you to compose a brief summary for the source. So that should highlight its argument. It should highlight, or the topic. Again, this is going to change if you are doing an academic source versus a popular source, just slightly, but enough to be aware of. So what are the main ideas or arguments? What is the methodology? So how are they supporting this argument or idea? What are the rhetorical strategies? What are the conclusions? So again, be aware of those slight differences, but summarize a source that you see yourself using. And I would also recommend as well to summarize it in a way that will allow you to copy and paste this lecture assignment into your working draft. And so if you see yourself saying, oh, this source, I'm going to use it to express disagreement on a certain idea, then use some of the verbs that we discussed for expressing disagreement. If you say, okay, well, this really sets up, this solution that I really want to talk about, then you can use more of the general claim verbs that we discussed or the recommendation verbs that we discussed. So really think about how you see this source fitting into your larger project too, and compose with that in mind. Because like I said, maybe you find that this is a really solid summary and you would want to use that in your project too. So now let's talk about the weekly homework. You'll want to include your core lecture 11 summary and assignment in your week 6 homework submission. Now, overall, your week 6 homework submission should include the summaries and lecture assignments for core lectures 11 and 12, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. That is all going to be due to Canvas before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, September 29th. If you have any questions or you'd like to discuss these concepts further, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas direct message. All right, everyone, until next time.